Few images evoke a sense of ancient Egypt more than this, the face of Nefertiti. She was the wife of a pharaoh and the stepmother to another.
For over 100.
There is a room inside the Neues Museum in Berlin where the air feels different. The lighting is precise, almost theatrical. The crowds move slowly, instinctively lowering their voices. In the center of that room, resting on a pedestal behind carefully controlled glass, sits a face that has stopped people cold for over a century. A perfect painted cheekbone, a long, composed neck, one eye finished in quartz crystal, the other socket empty and watching you anyway. It is the bust of Nefertiti, great royal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, crafted in limestone and stucco roughly 3,350 years ago, and considered by many scholars and art lovers alike to be the most beautiful portrait ever produced by any civilization on Earth. The bust was unearthed on the 6th of December 1912 during an excavation led by the German Egyptologist Ludwig Borchardt at the site of Tel El Amarna in Middle Egypt. The location was significant. Amarna was the ancient city of Akhetaten, the revolutionary desert capital built from scratch by Akhenaten when he dragged Egypt's entire religious and political machinery away from Thebes and remade it around a single god, the sun disk known as the Aten. By the time Borchardt arrived, the city had been buried and forgotten for more than 3,000 years. His team was digging through the ruins of a residential workshop complex, cataloged in the excavation records as Grid Square P47.2, which would later be identified through inscriptions as the studio of a royal sculptor named Thutmose. Thutmose held the title of king's favorite and master of works, which tells you something about his standing. He was not a craftsman. He was an artist trusted at the highest levels of state. When Borchardt's workers pulled the bust from the rubble of the collapsed studio floor, the German archaeologist stopped mid-sentence in his diary and wrote words that became famous in their own right. He described the piece briefly and then abandoned the attempt entirely, writing simply, "Description is useless, must be seen." It stood 48 centimeters tall and weighed 20 kilograms. The blue flat-top crown was intact. The painted surface was extraordinarily well preserved, and there was no inscription anywhere on the piece. No name, no cartouche, no royal title, just a face. The identification of that face as Nefertiti came gradually, through comparison with surviving temple reliefs and other royal portraits of the period. The distinctive crown she wore was one she appeared in repeatedly across multiple confirmed depictions, and scholars eventually reached a wide consensus. This was her. The bust was transported to Germany, and after spending its first years in the private home of the excavation's funder, a wealthy German entrepreneur named James Simon, it went on public display in Berlin in 1923 and became, almost overnight, one of the most recognized artworks on Earth. For decades, art historians and scientists assumed they understood the structure of the bust. The core was believed to be a rough limestone form, essentially a support structure, covered in layers of painted stucco that gave the sculpture its famous surface detail. It was a sensible assumption. That was how ancient Egyptian sculptors typically worked. The stone underneath was scaffolding. The art was in the plaster. The bust had actually been subjected to a CT scan as far back as 1992. But the technology of that era could only produce cross-sectional slices every 5 millimeters, which was not nearly fine enough to resolve what was hiding inside. The subtlety of what Thutmose had carved was located just 1 to 2 millimeters beneath the stucco surface. It required a different kind of machine to see it. In 2007, a research team led by Dr. Alexander Huppertz, director of the Imaging Science Institute at Berlin's Charité Hospital and Medical School, brought a 64-section spiral CT scanner to the bust. This was the same class of machine used in modern hospitals to produce detailed three-dimensional reconstructions of the human body. The technique fires X-rays through the object from hundreds of separate angles simultaneously, and software assembles the results into a precise volumetric image of everything inside, layer by layer, without touching or damaging the surface in any way. The team published their findings in April 2009 in the journal Radiology, and what they described changed the way the world understood this object. The limestone core was not a rough structural support. It was a fully realized, meticulously carved portrait of a woman. The interface was, according to the researchers, highly symmetric and delicately sculpted. Thutmose had not merely blocked out a general human form and relied on the plaster to do the work. He had carved a complete, detailed, individualized face in the stone itself before any stucco was applied. And when the research team compared that inner limestone face to the outer painted face the world had always seen, they found differences that were small in scale but enormous in implication. The differences between the inner stone face and the outer stucco face are not dramatic when listed individually. That is part of what makes them so significant. Nobody smoothed over obvious disfigurements. Nobody corrected a grossly inaccurate first attempt. The adjustments were precise, deliberate, and specifically targeted at features that carry age and individuality. The inner limestone face showed faint creases at the corners of the mouth. The outer face had none. The inner face had slightly less prominent cheekbones. The outer face gave her higher, more defined cheekbones. The inner face had a gentle bump along the ridge of the nose. The outer face smoothed it away entirely. The eyelid angles were subtly adjusted. The overall impression of the inner face, according to the researchers, was of a real human being, a woman of mature years, with the minor asymmetries and gentle marks of life that a real face carries. The outer face took that woman and edited her. It lifted her cheekbones, erased the lines around her mouth, straightened her nose, and produced the image of timeless, ageless, flawless perfection that has captivated the world for 100 years. Dr. Huppertz and his colleagues noted that the adjustments were consistent with the aesthetic ideals of the Amarna period and suggested that someone, possibly Akhenaten himself, had commissioned or ordered the alterations between the carved stone version and the finished stucco surface. What the researchers published was careful, scientific, and measured. What the findings implied, when placed against everything else known about the political context of this object, was something considerably more unsettling. To understand why those alterations matter, you have to understand who Nefertiti was and what the political landscape of the Amarna period actually looked like. Akhenaten, who reigned from approximately 1353 to 1336 BC, carried out what remains one of the most radical religious transformations in any ancient society. He dismantled the established temple networks of Egypt's traditional gods, stripped their priesthoods of land and authority, and declared that the only deity worthy of worship was the Aten, the physical disk of the sun. He closed temples, redirected resources, moved the capital to a brand new city in the middle of the desert, and positioned himself and Nefertiti as the sole human intermediaries between the Egyptian people and their new single god. No one else could approach the Aten directly. Worship had to pass through the royal couple. Nefertiti was not simply a decorative presence in this arrangement. She was a political force of the first order. Reliefs from the Amarna period show her performing sacred ceremonies alongside Akhenaten in roles that had traditionally belonged exclusively to the king. Other carvings depict her in a pose no Egyptian queen had ever been granted before, raising a war club over kneeling enemies, an image of martial power and divine authority that was previously reserved for pharaohs alone. She was depicted at the same scale as Akhenaten on multiple monuments, wearing the same style of crown, performing the same royal functions. Whatever her formal title, her actual role was that of co-ruler. And yet the regime she was a part of was deeply fragile. Akhenaten had not won Egypt's conversion through persuasion. He had imposed it through the power of the state. A population that had worshipped Ammonius, Osiris, Isis, and hundreds of other deities for 3,000 years was suddenly told that those gods no longer existed. The priests who had administered the old temples were stripped of their power. The economic networks built around the old religious institutions were collapsed overnight. This was not reform. It was revolution, and revolutions of that kind generate resentment that the official record rarely captures. Into that context, consider the bust. It was found in a sculptor's workshop, not in a temple, not in a palace, not in a tomb. Art historians have long argued that workshop busts of this quality and finish served as master templates, official reference models from which copies could be made and distributed across the empire to standardize the royal image. This was not a private portrait. It was a political instrument. And the face on that instrument was not the face Thutmose first carved in the limestone. It was an edited version. Younger, more symmetrical, more perfect, more godlike. The minor marks of age that the CT scan revealed in the limestone, the creases, the nose, the cheekbones, are not flaws. They are humanity. And someone decided that humanity was not what the image needed to convey. What the 2007 scan revealed about the construction process is also striking in its technical precision. The research team found that the bust was built up in a multi-step process. The inner limestone sculpture was carved first, a detailed, freestanding portrait in its own right. Then multiple layers of stucco of varying thickness were applied over different areas. The stucco on the face and ears was extremely thin, sometimes just millimeters, while the rear of the reconstructed crown contained two substantially thicker stucco layers. The variations in thickness were not uniform, which is what allowed the alterations to be so specific. Where the sculptor wanted to change a feature, the stucco was built up slightly more in that area. Where the stone portrait was to be left largely as carved, the plaster was minimal. The result was a technically sophisticated layered object in which the surface appearance and the structural reality could diverge in controlled, targeted ways. The outer face is not a lie in the crude sense. It is a refinement. A version of the real face processed through the filter of official standards, with the specific attributes of lived experience removed and replaced with the specific attributes of ideal power. The bump on the nose is gone, because noses on royal portraits should be straight. The lines around the mouth are gone, because this woman should not appear to age. The cheekbones are heightened, because prominence implies strength. What this means is that the sculptor Thutmose performed two separate acts of artistry, one inside the other. The inner face was the woman. The outer face was the symbol. And for 3,350 years, the world only ever saw the symbol. There is one detail about the bust that the CT scan did not explain, and which no amount of imaging technology has resolved, because it is an absence rather than a presence. The bust bears no inscription. There is no cartouche, no royal title, no name anywhere on the surface of the object. For a royal portrait of this quality and evident importance, that is genuinely strange. Egyptian royal art was almost obsessively textual. Names were not decoration. They were identity. A person's name, in Egyptian religious belief, was a fundamental component of their existence. To leave a name off a royal object of this significance was not an oversight. It was a choice. Some scholars have argued that the bust was never entirely finished, that the inscription was planned for a later stage that was never reached because the workshop was abandoned when Amarna was vacated after Akhenaten's death. Others have suggested that the nameplate area, now missing, may have once held a separate attached element bearing the inscription. Neither explanation is entirely satisfying. The bust shows no other signs of incompleteness. The painting is meticulous. The stucco work is precise. The detail is extraordinary throughout. This is not a rough draft waiting for final touches. It is a completed object. The absence of a name on a finished royal portrait of this quality, from a sculptor of Thutmose's standing, demands more than a routine explanation. What the name's absence ultimately means is that the most famous face of the ancient world arrive in the modern era as an unverified identity, identified not by what the object says about itself, but by comparison with images that do carry names. The woman behind the glass in Berlin is almost certainly Nefertiti, but the certainty rests on inference, not inscription. She was delivered to history nameless, and for a woman whose identity was subject to systematic erasure in the decades following her disappearance from the official record, that namelessness carries a weight that goes beyond the technical. The CT findings did not stand alone. They became part of a larger and accumulating picture of what the Amarna period actually was and what happened to the people who lived through it. Scientists who have analyzed mummy remains from the late Amarna period have documented elevated levels of heavy metals, mercury, arsenic, and lead, in tissues from individuals associated with the royal court. These metals were components of the mineral pigments used extensively in the painted temples, palaces, and ceremonial spaces of the Aten cult. Amarna was visually extraordinary. Contemporary accounts and surviving fragments describe surfaces saturated in color, painted reliefs covering every wall, a city designed as a physical manifestation of divine favor. But the pigments that produced that visual spectacle were chemically toxic. Long-term exposure to those compounds damages the nervous system, weakens immune function, and degrades bone density. The brilliant, sun-drenched environment that Akhenaten and Nefertiti built around themselves may have been systematically undermining the health of the royal family and court. The 18th dynasty's practice of close-kin marriage, documented in DNA analysis published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2010, compounded these environmental hazards. Multiple generations of marriages between close relatives, maintained in the belief that it preserved a divine bloodline, produced the genetic consequences that such unions reliably generate. Tutankhamun, who succeeded the Amarna rulers, showed clear physical evidence of this in CT scans of his remains, a clubfoot, bone disease, and a fragile physical constitution that almost certainly contributed to his death at around 18 or 19 years of age. Nefertiti ruled, was depicted, was used as the public image of an ideology, and then vanished from the official record around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign. What followed her disappearance? The erasure of names from temple walls, the systematic chisel work across multiple monuments, the evidence of hurried reattribution in objects later found in Tutankhamun's tomb, belongs to a larger story of dynastic upheaval and deliberate historical revision that Egyptologists are still working to fully reconstruct. Stand back from all the detail for a moment and consider what the bust actually is. It is a physical record of a decision made approximately 3,350 years ago by a master sculptor of extraordinary skill to conceal one version of a woman's face inside another version. The concealed face is the version that acknowledges her humanity, the small asymmetries, the gentle marks of maturity, the nose as it actually was. The visible face is the version that announces her divinity and untouchable power, perfected, stabilized, stripped of anything that might suggest vulnerability or change. The decision to apply that outer layer was not the sculptor's alone. Thutmose worked at the pleasure of the royal court. A portrait of this significance, intended as a master template for reproduction across the empire, would not have been altered at the individual artist's personal discretion. Someone in a position of authority sanctioned the changes. Whether that was Akhenaten himself, as Dr. Huppert suggested as one possibility, or a royal official overseeing the production of official imagery, the instruction came from power. The outer face of Nefertiti is not a portrait. It is a policy decision rendered in plaster. And here is what the CT scan revealed in its full implication. The world has been admiring that policy decision for 100 years, treating it as the authentic face of one of history's most powerful women, when the actual face of that woman was sealed inside the stone the whole time, visible only to the machines sophisticated enough to see through the surface. The inner face is not glamorous. It does not carry the composed, eternal serenity of the painted outer surface. It is the face of a real woman at the height of real power in a genuinely dangerous political moment, a woman with slight asymmetries, with a natural texture of a human face rather than the ideal geometry of a divine image. That face was carved with skill and care. And then it was covered up, as deliberately as any act of historical revision, with a more convenient version. Dr. Huppertz and his team were careful in their published conclusions. They noted that the alterations between the inner and outer faces were consistent with the aesthetic ideals of the Amarna period. They observed that the changes could reflect an artist's choice, or a patron's commission, or simply the standards of official royal portraiture. The science, in other words, describes what was done. It does not and cannot tell us who gave the order or precisely why. The British Museum's curator for ancient Egypt and Sudan, John H. Taylor, noted at the time of the publication that the scan raises interesting questions about why the features were adjusted, but acknowledged that definitive answers will be difficult to establish. That honesty is important. The gap between describing a physical alteration and proving a specific intent is real, and the 3,350 years between the workshop and the CT scanner is not a gap that can be fully bridged. What the scan does establish beyond any scientific doubt is that two separate portraits exist inside this one object. The first is carved in limestone and shows a woman with minor natural imperfections and the subtle marks of maturity. The second is built in painted stucco over the first and shows a woman whose every feature has been adjusted toward an ideal of ageless, flawless perfection. The first was hidden. The second was presented to the world. Whether that was aesthetics, propaganda, royal commission, cultural convention, or some mixture of all of them, the structure of the object itself is the evidence. The sculptor Thutmose knew what was inside. The royal court that commissioned the bust almost certainly knew what was inside. And for 33 centuries, until a 64-section spiral CT scanner in a Berlin hospital produced sub-millimeter cross-sections of a priceless ancient sculpture, nobody else did. The bust has had two lives since it left Amarna. The first began when Ludwig Borchardt pulled it from the rubble on December 6, 1912, and wrote in his diary that description was useless. The second began when it went on public display in Berlin in 1923 and became, within years, one of the most photographed and reproduced images on the planet. It has been printed on postage stamps, reproduced in museums from Tokyo to New York, referenced in fashion, film, and political rhetoric. It has been the subject of an ongoing repatriation dispute between Germany and Egypt that stretches across a century and remains unresolved. Egypt's renowned Egyptologist Ahi Hawass has led multiple campaigns to bring it home, and as recently as 2024 launched an international petition that has gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. The Neues Museum, where it has resided since 2009 in its own domed room illuminated by a dedicated skylight, describes it simply as the undisputed star of its collection. The irony embedded in all of this is precise and almost architectural. The bust survived 3,000 years because it was anonymous. It had no inscription. It had no name. When the city of Amarna was abandoned after Akhenaten's death and the new dynasty began the systematic work of erasing the Amarna period from Egypt's official memory, chiseling names from temple walls, dismantling monuments, reassigning or destroying objects connected to the Aten Revolution, the nameless bust in a sculptor's workshop was beneath the notice of the people carrying out that erasure. It was rubble. It was debris. It was nothing. The desert covered it, and 3,300 years later, it was the most famous face in the world. The face the world fell in love with was the edited version. The smooth nose, the lifted cheekbones, the lips without lines. The face inside, the one that carries a bump on its nose and faint creases at the corners of its mouth and slightly different cheekbones, has now been seen by the researchers who published the CT data and by anyone who has studied those images. But it remains sealed inside the stone, as it has been since Thutmose applied the last layer of plaster in approximately 1345 BC. The next time you see this bust, in a photograph, in a museum reproduction, in a documentary, behind the actual glass in the Neues Museum in Berlin, you are looking at a constructed image. You are looking at the decisions made by people 3,350 years ago about which version of a woman's face was acceptable for public display. The hidden face is still there. It has not been removed. It has not been damaged. The CT scan passed through it and reconstructed it in 3 dimensions, and then the scan was complete, and the bust was exactly as it had been before, the inner limestone portrait sealed inside the outer stucco portrait, 2 faces occupying the same space, one visible and one not. What the hidden detail in the Nefertiti bust reveals is not a scandal in any crude sense. It is something more precise and more enduring than a scandal. It is evidence that the act of constructing a public image, of deciding which version of a face represents power, which details are acceptable and which must be removed, is not an invention of photography or advertising or modern political communication. It is as old as civilization itself. It was happening in a sculptor's workshop in the Egyptian desert more than 3,000 years ago, carried out with a chisel and plaster by one of the most skilled artists of the ancient world, on behalf of people who understood that image and reality are not the same thing, and that the difference between them can be controlled. Thutmose knew exactly what he was doing. He carved the real woman first. Then he built the official woman over the top of her. The real woman is still inside, waiting.